They said she didn't belong, that the halls of Congress weren't built for girls with calloused hands, immigrant blood, or names they couldn't pronounce without stumbling. But she didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She walked in wearing the scars of her people and left the room shaking not from rage but from truth. Because when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood up and said, "This system was never built for us," she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was issuing a warning. What you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling of that warning, born not from a press release, but from the weight of a lived reality millions carry in silence. While the events you see may be fictionalized, the emotions they evoke are painfully real. The fight, the silence, the refusal to disappear. This isn't just a political story, it's a reckoning. She didn't feel taller in the graduation gown. If anything, it weighed on her shoulders like a borrowed confidence. Heavy, stiff, stitched for someone else's dream. The sun that day was sharp against the campus stone, and everyone around her was posing for pictures with arms wide, tassels swinging, champagne popping. But Alexandria held her diploma like it was a receipt, and in the other hand, folded and soft from weeks in her bag, was something far less glossy, the final hospital bill for her father's treatment. There was no applause when she opened it that night, just the slow creak of her apartment floor as she tiptoed across the small space they still called home. Her mother wasn't there. She was working her second job, cleaning offices in Manhattan after dark, quietly moving through the halls of law firms she would never enter during the day. Alexandria placed the diploma and the bill side by side on the kitchen table. Two pieces of paper, one meant to promise a future, the other a cruel invoice from the past. She stared at them like they were a riddle. That was the thing about growing up in the Bronx. You learned early how to decode silence, how to hear what wasn't said, in classrooms where the heat barely worked, in homes where parents hid bills in cereal boxes, in nights when you pretended you weren't hungry so your little brother could finish the leftovers. You understood that dignity often looked like pretending not to notice what was missing. Her father had died 2 years earlier, after a long and quiet illness that the system never fully acknowledged. The doctors were kind, but the numbers weren't. Each test, each appointment, each medication chipped away at the family savings like termites in the foundation. And when the money ran out, quietly without drama, it was as if the options ran out too. She remembered sitting by his bed the night before he passed, holding his hand while the machines beeped around them. He didn't talk much in the end, just one line he whispered, hoarse and half-dreaming, "Don't spend your life begging them to see you." She didn't cry when he died, not in the way people expected. She folded his favorite shirt, took down the family photos, helped her mother cancel the subscription to the Spanish newspaper he loved. But she never stopped hearing that line. It echoed through every debate stage, every classroom, every time someone said, "You don't look like a congresswoman." That night, in the apartment still lit by one buzzing ceiling light, Alexandria brewed coffee she couldn't afford to waste and opened her laptop. She didn't know what she was looking for. Jobs, maybe, or answers, or something to tell her that this degree actually meant something, that she wasn't just holding a $200,000 promise that the world had no intention of keeping. And then she saw it, a headline, small, barely visible beneath political gossip and celebrity noise. NY14, incumbent Crowley runs unopposed, again. No challenger, no debate, no alternative. Just a man with money and machines and 30 years of being told yes. She clicked on the article, heart slow and strange, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt something that wasn't numbness. It was quiet, yes, but it wasn't silence. It was the spark that came right before a storm, the kind you feel before the clouds roll in, when the air changes and something inside you says, "It doesn't have to stay like this." She looked again at the two papers on the table, the degree, the debt, and somewhere between them, she found the first word of a sentence she hadn't dared write. Not yet, but soon. She was 10 the first time she remembered the island feeling different. It wasn't the palm trees or the beaches. Those were in the postcards, not her memories. What she remembered were the wires, loose, tangled ones that hung too low across narrow streets, like spider webs built in a hurry. And the way the fans stopped spinning every afternoon, without warning, when the electricity dipped like a tired heartbeat. She remembered how Candle sat next to the rice pot like it was normal, and how her cousin, barely older than her, showed her how to flush a toilet using a bucket of rainwater. It was summer and Alexandria had come with her mother to visit relatives near Baimon. They brought suitcases filled with Vicks, cereal, and batteries. Things her mom said were hard to come by down here, though no one really explained why. She was too young to understand the word territory, but old enough to feel the difference. In New York, her teacher called her bright. In Puerto Rico, her family called her La Americana. Not unkindly, but not quite with pride either. One night, the rain came down hard. Not a storm, just the kind of summer rain that makes everything smell older. The power flickered, then vanished. Alexandria watched her great-aunt calmly light a match and set a candle on the kitchen table. The light danced across the old woman's face, deepening the lines near her mouth. That was when she heard her whisper it, barely above the hum of wind slipping through the cracked window. They call us citizens, but only when it's convenient. She didn't understand the weight of it at the time, just that it sounded like something you weren't supposed to say out loud, but it stayed with her. Through school, through the whispers about Puerto Rico being not really a state, through every news cycle that forgot the island unless a hurricane made landfall. She noticed how, when Puerto Rico was in need, officials sent thoughts and prayers faster than supplies. How her father's friends argued over elections while never realizing Puerto Ricans on the island couldn't vote for president unless they left the island first. Years later, sitting in her apartment with her diploma and her debt, Alexandria opened an old journal. In it, a childish scrawl from that same trip. I don't know why we're American, but different. She didn't have the answer then, but now she was beginning to. It wasn't just about borders or ballots. It was about invisibility, about being asked to serve, but never trusted to lead, about contributing soldiers, nurses, teachers, and janitors, but receiving less, expecting less, and being told to be grateful for crumbs. That memory, that night with the candle and the whispered truth, came back to her often, especially when people asked her why she talked so much about Puerto Rico. She never answered with policy points first. She answered with that moment, that voice, that light that stayed on even when the power didn't. And now, as she scrolled past headline after headline of disasters and denials, Alexandria felt the island in her ribs again. Not as a place to visit, but as a pulse, a reminder, a promise unfulfilled. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something harder, something sharper. It was the realization that if no one else would carry that part of the story into the room, then maybe finally it was time she did. The first thing she learned behind the bar wasn't how to make a perfect whiskey sour. It was how to read a person by the way they stirred their straw. The corporate guys in suits ordered fast and never looked up. The women who came in late from double shifts always tipped in crumpled bills and apologized for not tipping more. And then there were the men who'd ask her where she was from. And when she said the Bronx, they'd respond like it was a confession. By day, Alexandria was exhausted. But by night, she was alert, working in a loud Queens bar with sticky floors, TVs blaring, and hands always reaching for something. It wasn't glamorous, but it was alive, and it paid rent, just barely. Her shifts ended after midnight. She'd come home to her tiny apartment with aching feet, her hair smelling like fryer grease and spilled gin. But the moment she shut the door behind her, she'd drop her apron, pour tap water into a chipped mug, and open her laptop. The screen lit her face like a lamp in a cave. And that's when the second shift began. Political theory, case law, budget allocations, late-night C-SPAN videos, not for entertainment, but for understanding. She didn't study because someone told her to. She studied because the more she learned, the more the system stopped looking like a mystery and started looking like a machine. A machine designed to forget people like her, people like her mother, people like the woman who came into the bar every Thursday just to use the bathroom and warm her hands over the coffee machine. What unsettled her most weren't the big lies. It was the little phrases, the ones that sounded professional but left people bleeding. Means tested, fiscal responsibility, eligibility verification. They tossed these words around in committee rooms like they were math. But Alexandria had watched someone die waiting for Medicaid. She knew these weren't terms. They were weapons, blunt and slow and polite enough to pass without headlines. She once watched a senator on YouTube laugh while debating cuts to food assistance. He said the country had to make hard choices. Alexandria stared at the screen. She didn't feel anger, not at first. What she felt was a hollow cold, like the kind you get when someone makes a joke at your expense, and the room laughs because they don't realize it's about you. That was the night she couldn't sleep. She went to the window, cracked it open, and let the city noise bleed in. Sirens, horns, someone shouting in Spanish about the Mets. She stood there for a long time, thinking about her father's hospital bed, her mother's knees, the bar rag that never quite smelled clean no matter how much bleach she used. And she whispered it, almost as if afraid someone might hear. If I don't stand up, who will? She didn't have a plan yet. She didn't know how to run for office. She had no donor list, no fancy degree in political science, no media connections. Just a tired body, a loud mind, and a gut feeling that the people in power had mistaken her quiet for absence. But what they didn't realize was that some people don't yell until they've read everything worth reading. Some people don't fight until they've learned how the rules are rigged, and she was almost done reading. The first door she knocked on opened with a chain still latched. A woman in a hairnet peered through the narrow gap and narrowed her eyes. Alexandria smiled anyway, holding out a wrinkled flyer with her picture on it. Her real picture, no retouching, just a slight shine on her forehead from the summer heat. Hi, I'm Alexandria, and I'm running for Congress here in District 14. The woman glanced at the flyer, then looked back at her. You mean you're volunteering for someone? Alexandria shook her head. No, ma'am, I'm the one running. There was a pause, a beat of disbelief. Then came the laugh. Short, surprised, not cruel, just tired. The door didn't slam, but it didn't open all the way either. She got that laugh a lot. The Bronx was used to being talked at, not with. Election season brought polished shoes and promises, but none of those faces ever came back once the posters came down. So when Alexandria showed up in sneakers with a stack of leaflets and a borrowed clipboard, most people thought she was part of a student survey or maybe some census outreach. They weren't used to being asked for their voice, and they sure weren't used to being believed when they gave it. By the end of the first week, her knuckles were bruised from knocking, her throat dry from repeating herself, her shoes gray with dust from the sidewalks that ran past shuttered stores and stoops filled with plastic lawn chairs and quiet eyes. She would get home, peel off her shoes, ice her feet, and map the buildings she hadn't hit yet. Then she'd read more about zoning, school lunch programs, Section 8 vouchers, because when someone opened the door and asked real questions, she wanted to have real answers. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't always safe. There were days when the doors stayed shut, when people shouted, "Not interested," before she could say a word. But there were other moments too, like the teenage girl who opened the door with a baby on her hip, and when Alexandria said she was running, the girl blinked and asked, "For real?" Or the older man who didn't laugh, didn't speak much, just took the flyer and said, "You talk like my daughter. I hope she watches you." And slowly, almost invisibly, something began to shift. Not because she had money. She didn't. Not because she had endorsements. She had none. But because she wasn't selling a polished message. She was telling her story and asking people for theirs. She didn't lead with policy points. She led with her father's hospital bill, her mother's aching back, and the simple truth that no one is coming to save us, so maybe we save each other. And something about that stuck. One afternoon, a woman waved her over from a stoop. "You the girl from the news?" Alexandria shook her head. "Not yet." The woman laughed and said, "Well, you will be. I told my son about you. He didn't believe me. Said no one runs here unless they already got the seat." That night, Alexandria sat in her apartment, legs sore, head spinning, but her hands were steady as she updated her canvassing sheet. Next to a name, she wrote a small note in the margin. Listens, believes, told her son. It wasn't a poll number, but it was a start. And in a district where the doors had stayed shut for decades, a start felt like a miracle. She'd ironed the blazer twice, even though it didn't help much. The shoulders still sloped a little, and one button felt like it might pop if she took a deep breath. But it was the best one she had, and at least it matched the black flats she'd worn to 3 funerals and 1 job interview. The room wasn't grand, just folding chairs, a sagging stage, and a plastic pitcher of water at the side table. But everything about it felt heavier than she expected. There was a kind of hush in the air, not reverent, just skeptical, not hostile, but waiting to see if she'd stumble, waiting to confirm that she didn't quite belong. And her opponent? He wasn't there. Congressman Crowley had sent someone else, a soft-spoken man in a crisp gray suit, who introduced himself with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Alexandria nodded politely, but inside, she felt the old Bronx instinct rise. If they won't face you directly, they've already decided you're not worth the trouble. Still, she sat straight, listened carefully, and waited her turn. When the questions came, she didn't try to impress. She spoke the way she always had, with full sentences and full heart. She didn't have a team of advisors. What she had was experience, real, messy, unpaid, unpolished experience. When they asked about public education, she talked about how her elementary school still had textbooks from 1994. When healthcare came up, she mentioned her father, not with drama, but with a softness that made people lean in. And when a teacher in the audience asked about Medicare for all, Alexandria didn't list numbers. She said, "It's not just about who qualifies. It's about who gets to sleep at night without worrying how much breathing costs." It wasn't applause that followed, just a pause. That kind of pause you only hear when people are chewing on something that doesn't go down easy. Then came the question about student debt. The moderator, reading from a note card, asked, "How would you address college affordability without placing additional pressure on taxpayers or compromising educational quality?" The man in the suit answered first. He mentioned sustainability, institutional partnerships, long-term workforce outcomes. It was practiced, polished, and perfectly forgettable. Then it was her turn. She didn't stand up. She just rested her hands on her knees and said calmly, "I still owe over $20,000. It was quiet. She didn't need to dramatize it. The truth sat there, unadorned. That debt followed me into every apartment I rented, every job I applied for, every family decision I made. I'm not alone in that. It's not just a line item on a federal budget. It's a weight on people's backs, the kind that makes you second-guess your own future." Someone in the crowd nodded slowly. Another person adjusted their glasses but didn't look away. And for the rest of the evening, people listened to her a little differently. Not because she was louder, but because she'd said something they'd carried quietly for years. Afterward, a woman approached her, maybe in her 50s, hair graying at the temples. She said softly, "I never thought someone like you would run, but I'm glad you did." Alexandria smiled, warm and tired. She didn't know if she'd won the debate, but she knew she hadn't disappeared. And sometimes, especially in rooms like that, just staying visible is a kind of victory. The room wasn't full of cameras. No champagne corks popped, no stage lights, just a small apartment, 2 friends on the couch, and a box of lukewarm dollar-slice pizza sitting between campaign flyers and a half-empty bottle of seltzer. The numbers had just come in. Final, confirmed. Alexandria had done it. She had won. For a second, nobody said anything. The kind of silence that comes when something impossible just quietly becomes real. Then someone laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, more like a burst of disbelief. Alexandria blinked at the screen, her eyes tired, her heart thudding steady but calm. She whispered it out loud just to test if it still made sense. "We won." There were hugs, happy tears, a round of phone calls to volunteers who couldn't stay up late. And her mother who had fallen asleep praying and who called back with her voice cracking, said only, "Your father would have been so proud." Alexandria sat by the window as the city thinned into a deeper kind of night. Sirens in the distance, a breeze through the cracked sill. She thought about every step that had brought her here, the long days canvassing in worn-out sneakers, the debates where she'd felt invisible until she opened her mouth, the people who said no one like her could ever win. And now she had. Still, there was something quieter sitting underneath the joy. Not doubt exactly, but a knowing. a kind of heaviness that came not from fear, but from awareness. Winning wasn't the end of the climb. It was the beginning of the real incline. She didn't sleep much, maybe an hour. She woke up to sunlight sneaking through the curtain, her phone buzzing beside her pillow. At first it was congratulatory texts, journalists asking for quotes, old classmates resurfacing after years, cousins in Puerto Rico sending photos of her on TV. But then the tone changed, a message with no sender name. One line, "You don't know what you've started." Another, "Watch your back, bartender." Then a longer one full of slurs, too personal, too specific. She read it once, put the phone down, and sat there for a while. This wasn't a surprise. Not really. She had seen what happened to women who spoke too clearly. Women with skin like hers, accents like hers, names like hers. She had seen them be ridiculed, doubted, targeted. She'd even prepared herself for it, mentally. But knowing something's coming doesn't make it easier when it arrives. Still, she didn't let the fear take the lead. She got up, made coffee, tied her hair back, opened her laptop to begin answering emails. Later that day, she would meet with her new team. They would talk policy, press, planning. She would walk into rooms filled with suits and cameras, and some people would still call her kid or the bartender girl or ask her who she was there to assist. But now she understood something deeper. They weren't afraid of her title. They were afraid of her story, because her win hadn't been funded by a machine. It had been built on front porches, in church basements, on park benches with broken slats. It had come from people who had never seen someone like them on a ballot, and who finally had. She folded the threatening message into the back of a notebook. Not to forget it, but to remember what kind of courage this would require. Victory had come at midnight, but the real work, that would begin each morning after. She had known the headlines, read every article, watched the footage, followed the updates in real time like so many others. But nothing prepared her for the quiet. Puerto Rico didn't scream when it suffered. It waited, and when no one came, it simply tried to survive in silence. Alexandria stepped off the small plane with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and her heart already heavier than she expected. The air smelled of salt and damp cement. It had been months since Hurricane Maria, but the island still looked like it had just finished bracing for impact. Tarps, those unmistakable blue FEMA sheets, flapped in the wind like makeshift flags on rooftops that should have been repaired long ago. Power lines drooped. Some homes were nothing more than wooden frames, with cloth stapled to the sides for walls. Her aunt met her at the edge of the narrow road. They hugged quietly. No one cried. Inside, the house smelled faintly of mildew and lemon cleaner. The fridge hummed from a solar-powered battery. But there was no running water that day. Her aunt handed her a cup of boiled rainwater, cooled in the fridge beside a single bag of groceries they'd rationed over the week. "We've learned to stretch things," she said, not bitterly, just plainly, the way people do when they've long stopped expecting better. They sat outside under the overhang that afternoon as children passed by with plastic buckets on their way to a nearby church that had set up a makeshift water station. Some of the kids were supposed to be in school, but the local building had been damaged in the storm, and with no consistent electricity or Wi-Fi, remote learning was nearly impossible. Alexandria asked questions, took notes, but mostly she listened. Everyone thanked her for visiting. They were warm, generous. They offered her coffee they could barely spare. They told her stories of what it was like in the days after the storm, how the sky stayed gray and the nights felt endless without light, how insulin had to be kept on ice packs that melted too quickly, how people wrote their social security numbers on their arms with permanent marker, just in case they didn't make it. No one asked her to fix it. No one expected her to. That was the hardest part. They'd gotten used to being forgotten. At dinner, her cousin joked that Alexandria was too gringa now that she'd forgotten how to eat arroz con gandules without spilling it. They laughed, the kind of laughter that holds everything else in place. But when the plates were cleared and the lights flickered again, her aunt grew quiet. She looked at Alexandria and said softly, "I'm glad you came, but you don't have to carry all of this. It's too much." Alexandria nodded, but didn't agree, because it didn't feel like too much. It felt overdue. That night, lying on a cot beneath a ceiling fan that spun only when the generator had enough charge, she stared at the shadows on the wall and thought about how many Americans didn't even know Puerto Ricans were citizens. How often territory had been used as a polite way to say, not quite, and how the people here weren't asking for anything more than what they were owed. She thought of the kids hauling water, the medicine kept cool with prayers, the blue tarps that had become part of the landscape. And somewhere in all of that, a quiet promise began to form. Not loud, not grand, just steady. She wouldn't fix everything, but she could carry the stories, speak them in rooms where no one else would. Because silence, she knew by now, wasn't always chosen. Sometimes it was what you were left with when the world simply stopped listening. The conference room was cold in that artificial way, over-air conditioned and windowless, lined with polished oak and perfectly aligned water bottles. The chairs were more comfortable than necessary, the name placards pristine. Outside, the Capitol bustled with camera crews and tourist groups. But inside this closed-door budget meeting, there were no microphones, no flashing lights, just a quiet that felt more calculated than calm. Alexandria sat 2 seats from the end, her notepad open, pen steady. She'd come prepared. Pages of data highlighted in yellow, handwritten margins, filled with the names of schools still without power in Puerto Rico. Clinics still running on backup generators. Families still waiting on promised aid nearly a year after Hurricane Maria. She waited for her turn. When it came, she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked a question, clear and steady. Why has Puerto Rico received significantly less federal disaster aid than states with similar damage? There was a moment of stillness, a pause too long to be casual. Then a senior member across the table leaned forward, not unkind, but distant, like someone explaining a technical error that couldn't be helped. Because, he said with a small shrug, territories aren't priorities. No apology, no discomfort, just policy, as if that one sentence were self-evident. Alexandria didn't reply right away. She looked down at her notes but didn't see the numbers anymore. What she saw was her aunt boiling water for coffee in the dark, the blue tarp roofs stretching across neighborhoods like a second sky. She thought of the girl she met who still hadn't gone back to school, who'd said in a quiet voice, "It's okay, I'm used to waiting." She looked back up. There was no anger in her eyes now, not the kind people expected from her. What replaced it was something deeper, still, rooted, unshakable. She had learned long ago that rage, though valid, could be disarmed by those who claimed it was too loud. But conviction? That stayed. She leaned in slightly, her voice just above a whisper. If they had votes, she said, they might have lived. A few heads turned. Someone exhaled through their nose. No one responded. It wasn't meant to be rhetorical. The meeting moved on. The next topic read aloud in a monotone. But Alexandria kept writing. Except now, it wasn't just notes. It was questions, follow-ups, names of committee members, ideas for legislative language. Because what she heard in that room wasn't just indifference. It was a system speaking plainly. And systems, she had learned, didn't change out of guilt. They changed when someone stayed in the room long enough to hold them accountable. Later that evening, she stood alone in the hallway outside the chamber. Staffers passed her, phones in hand, murmuring updates and dinner plans. She leaned against the wall and looked at her reflection in a glass display case holding old legislative records. She didn't feel powerful. She felt clear. That sentence, "Territories aren't priorities," wasn't a misstep. It was an admission. And now she had it. She thought again of the island, the candles lit in kitchens, the notes taped to broken windows, the cousins who had stopped believing anyone in Washington even remembered they existed. She couldn't fix it overnight, but she could write it down, speak it out loud, carry it back into every room, every vote, every hearing, especially the ones that weren't televised. Because if the system insisted on forgetting them, then maybe it was time someone started remembering loudly. It started with silence. Not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that comes from outside it. When Alexandria reached out to the networks, none of them said no outright. They just didn't say yes. "It's not a major committee," one producer replied. "There's no big-name witness," said another. One response simply read, "We'll keep an eye on it." She knew what that meant. They wouldn't send cameras. They wouldn't assign a correspondent. In the eyes of the media, it wasn't a story, but it was. She'd heard too many voices during her visit to Puerto Rico, too many stories told in low tones, with tired smiles and shoulders that sank when someone asked what had changed since the storm. The answer was always the same: not much. So when the headlines wouldn't come to the hearing, she decided to go forward without them. The hearing room was smaller than usual, tucked into a side hallway of the Capitol, where echoes died quickly. The nameplates were modest: no banners, no live stream, just a stack of printed agendas, a pitcher of lukewarm water, and rows of folding chairs. The lighting flickered slightly in one corner. Still, the people came. Not press, not pundits, but the ones who'd lived it. A school nurse who'd worked through blackouts with only a flashlight. A farmer who'd lost every crop but found himself listed in no recovery report. A teenage boy who spoke for his grandmother, whose diabetes had worsened when medicine shipments stalled for months. They didn't shout. They didn't read from statements written by someone else. They told the truth, plainly and fully. Alexandria sat with them, notebook in hand, eyes steady, voice quiet when she asked questions. What did FEMA say when you called? How long did you wait before electricity returned? What would you have needed if anyone had asked you? There were no commercial breaks, no interruptions, no cutting to commentary, just story after story that had never made it into official records, not because they weren't real, but because they weren't convenient. At one point, someone asked why the hearing wasn't being covered. A man in the back, former city worker, wearing a faded collared shirt and a baseball cap, raised his hand and said gently, "They never wanted to see us in the first place." Alexandria nodded. She didn't offer comfort she couldn't guarantee. What she said instead was quiet but resolute. If they won't report it, we still record it. If they won't cover it, we still say it out loud. The witnesses didn't ask for applause. They asked for clean water, for working roofs, for dignity. She collected every page of testimony afterward herself, folded them carefully, placed them in a worn leather folder she carried like armor. One reporter from a small local paper showed up near the end, scribbling notes. She thanked him, even though she knew his story might never see front page. But that wasn't the point. Some hearings weren't for headlines. Some were for remembering, for letting truth breathe in spaces where it usually gets filtered. And when she left that room, Alexandria didn't feel defeated. She felt anchored, like she was walking with the weight of stories that weren't hers, but now depended on her voice to travel further than theirs ever had the chance to. Sometimes she realized the mic doesn't need to be live for the words to matter. They just need to be spoken. The room was quiet, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that signaled people had come to listen, not to argue, not to posture, just to bear witness. Alexandria sat at the edge of the table, a cup of water between her hands, pen resting idle beside her notepad. The hearing had no media lights, no sound engineers adjusting mics, no countdown from a producer in her ear. It was just folding chairs, softly shuffled papers, and the sound of voices, some steady, some trembling, recounting the kind of truth that never makes it past commercial breaks. The first to speak was a woman named Elena. She wore a simple blouse and held a photograph in her lap, one hand resting protectively over its corner. Her voice was clear, though something in it bent gently, like wood that had been carrying weight too long. She told the story slowly, almost apologetically, as if she feared taking up too much time. Her son had been 13 when the storm hit. He had asthma, not severe, but enough that they always kept his medication on hand. When the roof tore open during the night, the medicine cabinet went with it. It took 6 hours for the ambulance to arrive. 6 hours of sitting on the floor, trying to keep him calm, counting his breaths, watching them grow shallower. By the time help came, it was too late. No one in the room interrupted. No one told her to stop. She didn't cry, not exactly. Her eyes glistened, but the tears never fell. It wasn't silence for silence's sake. It was the kind born from people who had nothing left to prove. Next was Manuel, a soft-spoken man with calloused hands and a worn baseball cap. He didn't bring notes, just memories. He spoke about his father, a diabetic, who had been rationing insulin for weeks after the storm. The pharmacy had run out. The clinic's refrigerator stopped working when the generator failed. No one came to restock. "We thought we were being patient," he said, voice cracking once and only once. "Turns out we were just being forgotten." He described the final night, how they sat together in the dark, how his father insisted he take the last slice of bread, how the air felt heavy even without rain. When the breathing changed, it was so slow he didn't notice at first. When it stopped, there was no one to call. No line that worked, no siren, just mourning. Alexandria kept her gaze steady, but her hand moved quietly across the page. She wasn't writing sound bites. She was recording grief the way it was offered, gently, plainly, without punctuation. Other voices followed, a teacher whose school had collapsed but who still held lessons under a tarp, a young woman whose grandmother had died not from injury, but from infection left untreated in a flooded neighborhood where no help arrived for 3 weeks. None of them shouted. None of them demanded anything. They just wanted to be heard, once fully, without being rushed or reframed. And though the room wasn't crowded and no reporter jotted headlines, something deeper lingered in the air that afternoon. A kind of reverence not for what was said, but for the fact that it had finally been said at all. As the session paused for a short break, Alexandria folded her notes and looked around. No camera had captured these stories. No trending topic would lift them into national conversation. But they had been spoken, fully, freely, and that alone had changed something, even if no one outside the room knew it yet. The room had settled into a rhythm, witnesses speaking one after another, their stories quiet but heavy. Alexandria had stayed mostly silent through it all, not out of hesitation, but because she knew when to let others carry the floor. This wasn't about her, but now it was her turn to speak. She straightened the papers in front of her, though she didn't need them. What she was about to say wasn't written on the page. It had lived in her bones for years. She looked up, scanning the modest room, not for the cameras that weren't there, but for the eyes that were. A few staffers, 2 reporters from small local outlets, 1 senator she didn't quite trust to stay through the whole session, and an older member of the committee who'd been elected before she was born. He sat with arms folded, expression unreadable. She cleared her throat softly. "We've heard stories today," she began, "about delays, about shortages, about the slow erosion of what's supposed to be guaranteed care. And I'd like to enter something else into the record, a personal account." No one stopped her. She didn't ask for permission. "My father was diagnosed with cancer when I was still in college. It was late stage by the time they found it. Not because we ignored the signs, but because the screenings he needed weren't covered. Because we had to choose between rent and appointments." Her voice didn't waver, but it softened, landing gently with each word. "We did what a lot of families do. We rationed our hope. We stretched pills. We searched for clinics. We learned how to read billing codes like a second language." She paused just long enough for the quiet to grow dense. "And in the end, he didn't die only from the disease. He died from navigating a system that made death easier than care. He died from forms, from wait lists, from the cost of being poor in the wrong zip code." No one moved. Across from her, the older senator adjusted his glasses. He didn't speak. "I know what some of you are thinking, that personal stories can't shape national policy, that emotion clouds analysis. But let me be clear, data is important. But data without story is a chart without context, and this country is full of stories like mine. Thousands of them, invisible in the reports, etched into the lives of people who never made it to a hearing like this." Her hand rested on the table, firm but relaxed. "So when I ask why Puerto Rico still doesn't have equitable access to federal health funds, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for consistency, for recognition, for justice that doesn't depend on your statehood, your accent, or whether someone thinks you vote the right way." The room stayed silent. No shuffle, no cough. Then quietly, the older senator shifted in his seat. He looked down, not in shame exactly, but in that way people do when they're reminded that policy isn't abstract, that decisions made on paper settle in people's homes, on hospital beds, in the last breaths of people who were told to wait just a little longer. He didn't interrupt, didn't counter, just nodded once slowly. It wasn't a debate moment. There was no applause, no grandstanding. But it felt like something had landed, not to win, but to be seen. Later, someone would ask her if it was hard to talk about her father in that way, in such a public setting. She would reply gently, no harder than it was to bury him, knowing he deserved more. Because sometimes the most powerful question isn't the one that stuns your opponent, it's the one that makes them look down and realize they had no answer all along. No one planned for the clip to go viral. There was no press release, no coordinated post, no soundbite crafted to echo across social feeds. The hearing hadn't even been live streamed. Just a small room with bad lighting and tired chairs, and a handful of people who spoke because someone finally let them. But someone, a volunteer, maybe a staffer, had been recording quietly from the corner with a shaky phone camera. Not for publicity, just for record keeping. And when the clip went up later that evening, quietly with a simple caption, she listened like it mattered. No one expected what would happen next. The footage wasn't polished. The audio dipped once or twice. The camera shook a little when it zoomed in. But that might have been why it hit so deeply. Because what it captured wasn't a speech, it was a moment. Alexandria sitting there, still, her pen resting untouched beside her notes. A woman across from her, finishing a story about losing her son during the blackout. How they waited hour after hour for help that never came. And then the pause. The moment in the video, barely 6 seconds, showed Alexandria looking up, her eyes full but steady, lips slightly parted like she was about to speak but chose not to. She didn't wipe away the tear that welled up. She just held it there, in the open, without flinching. It was that look, unrehearsed, unwavering, that made the internet stop. By morning, the clip had been shared across every platform. The caption changed with each account. This is what compassion looks like in politics. Why isn't this on the news? The hearing that shamed a nation. She hadn't even known it had been recorded. A staffer texted her the next day, "You're everywhere." At first, she thought it was about her statement from the day before. But when she clicked the link, it wasn't her words. It was her silence. She sat at her kitchen table that morning, still in a worn sweater, scrolling through comments. Teachers, nurses, mothers, veterans who'd served in Puerto Rico and written about what they saw. Strangers sharing their own losses. Thousands of them, and none asking for spectacle. Just space. Just someone to keep holding that look a little longer. She didn't repost it. She didn't need to. The clip had moved on its own, from phone to inbox to timeline to memory. It was being shown in classrooms, discussed on radio shows, and even clipped into an op-ed by someone who once dismissed her as naive but well-meaning. And through it all, Alexandria said very little, because some moments don't need amplifying, they just need witnessing. Later that week, a constituent approached her in the produce aisle of a small Bronx grocery store. The woman didn't ask for a selfie. She didn't mention the news. She just touched Alexandria's arm and said, "You didn't cry for attention. You cried because it was too much not to." Alexandria smiled softly. There was nothing more to say. She knew that virality fades, that algorithms forget. But what mattered wasn't the views. It was the fact that, for once, the stories that never made it to television had reached people anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something was beginning to change. Not because someone shouted the loudest, but because someone stayed quiet long enough for others to speak. Sometimes, what moves a nation isn't what's scripted. It's what's still felt after the camera turns off. The room looked just like every other hearing. Neutral carpet, polished nameplates, cold water poured into plastic cups. But there was something in the air that morning, something stiff and expectant. Alexandria could feel it before she spoke, like the space around her was already prepared to shrink. It was a routine budget session, or so they said. She'd been reviewing the proposed allocations all week, numbers that looked tidy in print but told messy stories when you knew how to read between them. Cuts here, delays there, and buried in the fine print. More of the same for Puerto Rico. When they called her to speak, she leaned forward, steady, calm. No theatrics. She started by thanking the committee, then moved to her point, raising a concern about disproportionate funding for disaster recovery, referencing recent testimony from survivors, connecting it back to the structural issues in how territories were treated during federal budgeting. That's when it happened. The chair cut her off mid-sentence, his voice firm but dry. "Congresswoman, we ask that members stay on topic. This hearing pertains to domestic budget priorities." She blinked once. Let the words settle. "With respect," she replied gently, "this is a domestic issue. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Their budgets are our budgets." He didn't look up. He just reached toward the mic control panel and pressed a button. A soft click. Her microphone went silent. The silence was jarring. Not loud, not angry. Just final. She looked around the room. No one said a word. Some eyes shifted away. Others looked down at notes, at nothing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She simply kept speaking, even though she knew the mic was off. Her words, quiet as they were, still traveled to those seated close enough to hear. If fairness is off topic, then maybe the topic needs changing. No cameras zoomed in. No reporters scribbled furiously. The transcript recorded only the interruption, not the rest of her sentence. It would have been easy for the moment to vanish entirely, but someone had recorded it on their phone. Blurry, unplanned, just an intern sitting near the wall. The clip made its way online before the end of the day. It showed her lips still moving as her mic light went dark. It captured the tension in the room, the purposeful quiet, the moment someone powerful decided not to hear. And it spread, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. By evening, the video had circled the internet. By morning, it had been shared millions of times. Comments poured in, some furious, some heartbroken. She was silenced for speaking the truth. They turned off her mic, not her message. This is what they do when they can't argue back. Alexandria read none of it that night. She went home, made tea, and called her mother. They talked about groceries, about the weather, about a cousin's new baby. She didn't bring up the hearing until her mother asked gently, "Was it hard today?" She paused, then answered. They turned off the mic. A beat of silence. Her mother didn't ask what she'd said. She just replied, "They always do that first, before they pretend they didn't hear you." And Alexandria smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. She knew by now that being silenced in the room didn't mean the world hadn't heard. Some voices don't need volume. They need truth. And truth, once spoken, even in a whisper, finds a way to echo. The headlines came quickly, as they always do, short, sharp, and designed to sting. Not one of them quoted her words in full. They didn't have to. It was easier to reduce her to an image, a label, a mood. The meltdown of Miss Ocasio-Cortez, when feelings trump facts. Emotionally unfit and too loud to lead. She read the first few out of obligation, not interest. They all sounded the same, written by people who had never stepped foot in the room she sat in, who had never waited hours in a hospital with a dying parent, who had never walked to work because a $2.75 subway fare was too much some weeks. People who hadn't lived it, but were somehow experts on how she should carry it. Then came the threats, some anonymous, some with return addresses that were clearly fake. There were messages scrawled in all caps, laced with racial slurs and cheap rage. A few emails tried to cloak themselves as concern, saying she needed to get help before she embarrassed herself further. She didn't cry reading them. Not from fear, at least. The fear was already something she had made peace with. What unsettled her wasn't the violence in the words. It was how ordinary they had started to feel. Every public woman knew this pattern. Raise your voice, be called shrill. Lower it, be called weak. Show emotion, be dismissed as unstable. Show none, be accused of being cold. She had stopped trying to thread that impossible needle. But still, on some mornings, the noise found its way in. She was sitting at her desk late one evening, surrounded by printed briefings and a half-eaten sandwich, when a staffer knocked gently and handed her a stack of mail. "More letters," he said. "Some you might not want to read, but this one?" He paused and smiled a little. This one felt different. It was written in neat cursive, addressed from the south side of Chicago, postmarked 3 days earlier. No email handle, no hashtags, Just paper, pen, and care. She opened it slowly. Dear Congresswoman, I'm not someone who writes letters like this. My mom raised me to be quiet in rooms of power, to not cause trouble. She never cried at the news. Never cried at all, really. But yesterday she watched you speak. Not yell, not plead, just speak. And when you paused right before they cut your mic, she wiped her face with the edge of her apron. I asked if she was okay, and she said, "She reminds me of someone we lost." She still believes. You were the first person who made my mother cry because she felt hope, not grief. Thank you. It wasn't long, barely a paragraph. But Alexandria read it twice, then once more, slower. She folded it carefully, placing it between pages of her planner, not to file it, but to keep it near. It didn't drown out the cruelty of the others, but it didn't need to. It was enough to remind her why she was still sitting in that chair, still reviewing documents, still showing up to rooms where the mic might cut off again. Some days the noise was loud, but letters like that, they were the quiet that restored her. That night she made tea and sat by her window as the city murmured outside. For once she didn't plan her next statement. She just let the silence sit beside her, not as an absence, but as a kind of peace. Because sometimes one voice on paper can carry more weight than 1,000 shouted headlines. And in that moment, she let it. The morning was still, no texts, no news alerts, just the quiet shuffle of paper and the hum of the old radiator in her apartment. Alexandria sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at the half-written letter in front of her. It was to her mother. She'd started it the night before after reading yet another round of threats and headlines. She wanted to say sorry for the worry, for the constant turbulence, for choosing a life where safety was never guaranteed. She'd written 3 sentences, then stopped. How do you explain to the person who raised you that the fear is real, but the silence would be worse? She folded the letter anyway. Not finished, but honest. Then she dressed. The blazer was old, a little faded at the elbows, but it still held its shape. It reminded her of the first day she'd walked into City Hall years ago. Heart pounding, but posture straight. Some clothes hold memory like skin. There were no reporters waiting outside today, no press release, no tweets announcing the session. Just a committee meeting tucked in the corner of a long schedule, one about community health access in underserved zip codes. No cameras, but names on the attendance list and people who didn't usually get heard. As she walked into the room, a staffer looked up, surprised. "Didn't think this one would get much attendance," he whispered. She smiled softly. "That's why I came." During the hearing, she didn't raise her voice once, but she did raise stories. A grandmother in Brooklyn who rationed insulin so her grandson could eat. A street medic in San Juan who reused gloves because the clinic couldn't afford more. A school nurse who taped broken thermometers to cardboard to teach kids how to check for fever. Each story was real. Each one had a name. She didn't dramatize them, just laid them gently on the table, one by one, until silence filled the room, not out of boredom, but out of weight. One representative tried to pivot the topic. "Let's not confuse anecdote with data," he said. AOC nodded. "Then let's add both." And she did. Bar graphs, reports, budget breakdowns. Not flashy, just factual. Quiet tools that spoke louder than outrage ever could in that space. The session ended without applause. Most members filed out quickly. But as she packed her notes, a staff assistant, barely older than a student, lingered near the door. She hesitated, then said, "My dad's from PR. He always told me politics didn't care about us." Today felt different. Alexandria tucked her folder under her arm and offered a small smile. "Maybe we just need to show up enough times until different feels normal." That night back home, she didn't check the news. Didn't post a recap. She just sat back down at the kitchen table, unfolded her letter, and added one more line. "I didn't go today to be seen. I went so they'd stop being invisible." She signed it. Love, A. Some battles are loud. Some victories make headlines. But the choice to return, to show up without spectacle, to speak when no one is watching, that's the kind of loud that stays. She didn't expect applause. She didn't even expect agreement. Alexandria knew what kind of room she was walking into the moment her name appeared on the docket for that morning's legislative session. But she also knew something else. This wasn't about politics. It was about grief that never healed and systems that never changed. The bill was simple on paper, but radical in its implication. Expand Medicaid funding to U.S. territories, places like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, where millions of American citizens lived under a healthcare ceiling set lower than the rest of the country. She titled it quietly, the Gabriel Ocasio Health Equity Act. Some in the chamber raised their eyebrows. Others exchanged glances. A few chuckled, as if amused by the naivete of someone who still believed a name could change a system. One senator leaned back and murmured, not quietly enough, touching, but symbolic bills don't treat patients. Alexandria adjusted the microphone. You're right. Symbols don't heal people, but systems shaped by indifference don't either. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. Instead, she opened a folder, its edges worn from nights of preparation, and pulled out the first sheet, a line graph. Puerto Rico's per capita Medicaid funding, 37% lower than the national average. She continued calmly. This chart shows funding, but let me show you something else. This is my father's story. There was no slideshow, no dramatic pause, just her voice. My dad died when I was 19, but he didn't just die because of illness. He died because for 2 years before that, our insurance juggled his coverage. Because in Puerto Rico, the hospital had one cardiologist rotating between 3 wards. Because someone decided that geography determined how long you should wait for care. The room was still. She turned another page. From the Puerto Rico Institute for Health Policy, a diabetic patient in rural PR is 1.8 times more likely to suffer limb amputation than one in Kansas, due solely to lack of timely care. That's not a statistic. That's a sentence. Somewhere in the back, a pen dropped. Alexandria looked out at the room, not confrontationally, just steadily. I know what some of you are thinking. This won't pass. It's too ambitious. It's not politically convenient. But if we only wrote laws for convenience, then we wouldn't call this a democracy. We'd call it a marketplace, and some of us would always be the ones priced out. She paused, letting the air settle. When I started drafting this bill, I kept asking myself, how do I make them care? Do I have to cry? Do I have to tell you he was kind? Or that he taught me math on Saturday mornings? Or that he apologized when he couldn't afford my textbooks? Would that make it real enough? She smiled, almost apologetically. But I realized I don't need you to care about my father. I need you to care about the fact that there are fathers like him, still alive, still fighting the same barriers, still losing. And we, in this room, get to decide whether that continues. The chamber was quiet, not unanimous, not persuaded, but attentive in a way it hadn't been before. She closed the folder. This isn't just a health bill. It's a map toward a country that doesn't ration decency based on zip code. Later, when the press asked if she thought the bill would pass, she said honestly, I don't know, but I know it deserves to be heard. And I know the man it's named after never asked to be remembered, only to be treated like he mattered. This is the least I can do. And that night, back at her desk, she reread the text of the bill again, alone, her father's name in the header, and a quiet resolve in her heart that if the system still whispered no, she would keep showing up until the answer changed. The hearing room was unusually quiet that day, not the silence of indifference, but the kind that comes when people sense something different in the air. There were no fireworks expected on the agenda, just another debate on healthcare policy disparities, or so they thought. AOC entered without the usual noise. No entourage, no spotlight, just a small binder in her hand and that calm, steady pace she often carried when the stakes were higher than they looked. She had read every word of the bill, every footnote of the funding allocations, and every single testimony sent in by women from the territories. Voices no one had invited into the official record. She sat, opened her binder, and asked her first question. Senator, according to the 2023 GAO report, what percentage of rural clinics in U.S. territories report equipment failure at least once a month? The senator blinked, shifted in his seat. I don't have that exact figure. She nodded, not with judgment, just with clarity. Then she turned the page. Page 14, 63%. And do you know how many of those clinics reported having backup equipment? He stayed silent. 7%, she continued, still with that same even tone. 7 out of 100. She wasn't looking for a moment. She was laying a foundation. Over the next 20 minutes, she didn't raise her voice once. She didn't grandstand or pivot for headlines. She simply walked through data like a trail of lanterns, each one illuminating something inconvenient, something avoidable, something cruel. She quoted a nurse who had to reuse gloves for 4 patients in one shift, a mother whose daughter died waiting for a birth ambulance that never came, a young woman who gave birth on the floor of her own home with a neighbor's towel and a flashlight app. And when another senator interrupted her, his voice growing louder with each sentence, his hands tightening into fists around his water bottle, she didn't flinch. He accused her of emotional manipulation, of cherry-picking data, of not understanding the logistical complexity of non-state governance. But she didn't respond in kind. She didn't match his volume or tone. She just looked at him, nodded once, then asked, "Which part of her story do you think she made up?" He froze. The nurse? The mother? The girl with the towel? Silence. They're not footnotes, Senator. They're names. If the problem was the data, you'd have refuted it. But the problem is you believe me, and you're terrified others will too. The words weren't loud, but they carried. One reporter in the back, who hadn't planned to write about the hearing, looked up from his phone. That's when it shifted. No applause, no viral clip. Just the sound of papers rustling and something invisible cracking open in the air. AOC closed her binder gently and leaned back in her chair. The senator who had interrupted her was visibly rattled, but she didn't push further. There was no need. The truth had already done the work. Later, someone asked her why she hadn't responded more forcefully. She smiled and said, "Sometimes letting them show us who they are is louder than anything I could say." And then, more quietly, "They don't fear me. They fear us believing her." That evening, the transcript of the hearing made its way online, not on major news outlets, but on community forums, in newsletters from nurses' unions, in a blog post by a medical student from San Juan who wrote, "I've never seen someone ask a question so gently, it left a senator speechless." By midnight, a grandmother in Mississippi had shared it. A teacher in Alaska saved the clip. And a teenager in Chicago wrote in the comments, "She didn't need to shout. She made truth sound like something you could sit with." In a building built for noise, AOC had chosen something else. Stillness, precision, and the softest kind of power, the kind that doesn't ask for belief. It earns it. And maybe that's what they feared most. In a small bedroom at the edge of El Paso, a 15-year-old girl named Mariela sat cross-legged on her carpet, earbuds in, laptop open, and heart pounding just enough to remind her that this moment mattered. Her room wasn't much: taped up posters, secondhand desk, a mirror with sticky notes of dreams. But tonight it became a studio. She clicked record. "Hi," she whispered into the mic she had borrowed from her older cousin. "This is the mic was never off. And I guess this is the first time I'm saying that out loud." There was a pause, a breath. Then her voice steadied. "I'm not starting this because I have all the answers," she said. "I'm starting it because someone, somewhere, reminded me that my questions are enough." She spoke slowly, carefully, as if placing words down like stepping stones across a river she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. In school, they always tell you about people who change things: presidents, inventors, generals. But they don't talk about what it feels like to want to speak and feel like the room was built without a mic for you. She smiled nervously. "Until I saw her." Mariela didn't need to say the name. The listeners, if there were any, would already know. Her walls carried sketches of AOC, drawn in pencil, sometimes colored with whatever markers she could borrow. One quote was taped right above her desk. "They tried to bury us, but we were seeds." "I watched a video last week," she said, "of her in a hearing. She didn't shout. She didn't throw anything. She just asked a question and waited. And the silence that came after, that was louder than any speech I've ever heard." Mariela paused. Not because she forgot what to say, but because she was letting the emotion find its own pace. And I realized she didn't make me strong. She just made me realize I already was. The first episode was short, less than 10 minutes, but it wasn't about length. It was about beginning. She signed off with a soft promise. If no one ever gave you a mic, I hope this podcast lets you feel like you have one now. Then she ended the recording and sat still, staring at the screen. For a moment, she wondered if it even mattered. This quiet little act, this first ripple. But a week later, someone left a comment. My daughter listened to this. She's 11. She asked if she could make her own too. Another message came from a teacher in Laredo. I played your podcast in class. The boys finally stopped talking. The girls finally started. And slowly, episode by episode, the mic was never off grew. Not in charts or rankings, but in reach. It was shared in WhatsApp groups for mothers, in libraries where teens gathered after school, in community centers where old microphones sat unused. By her 6th episode, Mariella had interviewed a cafeteria worker from her school who'd been an activist in the 90s. By her 10th, a single father who taught himself how to read by listening to audiobooks. She didn't frame these people as heroes, she just let them speak. And somehow, that made them unforgettable. One morning, as she was setting up for a recording, she got an envelope in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a card with 5 simple words. I heard you? Thank you. Mariella looked at it for a long time, then taped it next to her AOC quote. Years from now, no one might remember her first episode, or her nervous voice, or her tiny room with paper-thin walls. But for the girls who listened, it wasn't about memory. It was about recognition. She didn't need a podium. She built her own. And she didn't wait for permission. She simply began. Because somewhere deep inside her, even before AOC, even before the podcast, she already knew. The mic was never off. It was just waiting for her to speak. The cemetery was quiet that morning, still but not heavy, just the kind of silence that makes you breathe slower. AOC walked without saying much, her mother a few steps behind. Both women wrapped in long coats, though the spring sun had started to warm the air. She had made this visit before, many times, but today felt different, not because of what she had to say, but because of what she finally didn't need to explain. She knelt down beside the grave. The stone was modest, worn gently by the seasons. Her father's name, his birth year, and that short dash before the end. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. No speech, no headline. Just 7 quiet words in her own handwriting. I didn't scream, I stayed. She laid it down carefully at the base of the stone, tucking it under a smooth rock so the wind wouldn't carry it away. Her mother stood silently, eyes fixed on the note. She didn't ask about it, didn't question what it meant. She didn't have to. Instead, she sat down next to her daughter and reached for her hand. Fingers worn from years of work, strength pressed into every line of her palm. They sat there for a long time, not trying to name the feeling. No words were exchanged, just a quiet, shared understanding between 2 women who had loved the same man, lost him, and carried him forward in different ways. And for the first time in a long time, AOC didn't feel like she was holding up the world alone. She just felt held. It was supposed to be an informal gathering, just a few community leaders, a circle of folding chairs, a pot of coffee slowly growing cold on the side table. The kind of space where people speak freely, without lights, without scripts. When it was AOC's turn to talk, she stood up gently and smiled, almost apologetically. I didn't prepare anything, she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Honestly, I didn't think I needed to. There was a quiet laugh or two, a nod of recognition from someone in the back. She paused, looking around the room, not at officials or donors, but at teachers, organizers, nurses, a teenager with a notepad, people who weren't usually asked what they thought. I've been in rooms where people are certain, she began, so certain they forget how doubt can teach you to listen. I'm not always sure. I don't always know the right words in the right order. Her voice didn't rise, it softened instead. But I try to show up anyway. And when I do, I try to stand next to the people who've been told their voice doesn't matter, who've been asked to wait, who've been taught to whisper. She let the silence settle before adding, I don't have to be the loudest. I just have to be honest about where I stand. And I choose to stand with those who are rarely believed. No applause followed, just that kind of stillness where something true has been said. A stillness that stretches gently into the space between people and makes them feel just a little more seen. And that was more than enough. It was just before sunrise. The sky was still holding on to the last traces of night, and the city below hadn't yet stirred. On the small stone balcony outside her apartment, AOC wrapped her hands around a warm mug and leaned slightly forward, her gaze steady on the Capitol dome in the distance. She didn't speak. Not yet. There was something sacred in the silence of that hour, something she didn't want to rush. The building glowed faintly, lit by the soft gold of pre-dawn. For generations, it had stood as a symbol, majestic, immovable, selective. A place where decisions were made for people who rarely got to sit in the room. A place built with a vision that didn't include voices like hers. She let out a quiet breath, not one of weariness, but of understanding. In that stillness, a voice began, not aloud, but in the kind of voiceover that comes from within, the kind we don't always know we're narrating. They didn't build this place for us, the marble, the chambers, the legacy. It wasn't meant to reflect faces like mine or stories like my father's. But here we are, not asking for permission, just showing up. And by being here, we change what this place means, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. She set the mug down gently on the ledge, her fingers brushing the rim once before stepping back inside. The moment didn't need fanfare, just presence. In the distance, the light over the Capitol grew brighter, imperceptibly at first, then steadily, spilling warmth across its stone face. A new day was beginning, and she would be there for it. What struck me most was the quiet power of showing up, not to shout, but to stand. AOC didn't need grand speeches in that final scene. Her presence alone facing the Capitol said everything. That spaces can be redefined simply by who dares to exist in them. This story reminds us that change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady, unshakable decision to stay when the room wasn't built for you. That's courage in its most transformative form. What about you? Have you ever stayed in a space where you felt unseen, just to make it more possible for someone else to be seen later? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.